On Saturday, May 22nd, 1971, I went to Sonora, Mexico, to see Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian sorcerer, with whom I had been associated since 1961. I thought that my visit on that day was going to be in no way different from the scores of times I had gone to see him in the 10 years I had been his apprentice. The events that took place on that day and on the following days, however, were momentous to me. On that occasion, my apprenticeship came to an end. This was not an arbitrary withdrawal on my part, but a bona fide termination. I've already presented the case of my apprenticeship in 2 previous works, The Teachings of Don Juan and A Separate Reality. My basic assumption in both books has been that the articulation points in learning to be a sorcerer were the states of non-ordinary reality produced by the ingestion of psychotropic plants. In this respect, Don Juan was an expert in the use of 3 such plants: Datura inoxia, commonly known as Jimson weed, Lophophora williamsii, known as peyote, and a hallucinogenic mushroom of the genus Psilocybe. My perception of the world through the effects of those psychotropics had been so bizarre and impressive that I was forced to assume that such states were the only avenue to communicating and learning what Don Juan was attempting to teach me. That assumption was erroneous. For the purpose of avoiding any misunderstandings about my work with Don Juan, I would like to clarify the following issues at this point. So far, I have made no attempt whatsoever to place Don Juan in a cultural milieu. The fact that he considers himself to be a Yaqui Indian doesn't mean that his knowledge of sorcery is known to or practiced by the Yaqui Indians in general. All the conversations that Don Juan and I have had throughout the apprenticeship were conducted in Spanish, and only because of his thorough command of the language was I capable of obtaining complex explanations of his system of beliefs. I've maintained the practice of referring to that system as sorcery, and I've also maintained the practice of referring to Don Juan as a sorcerer, because these were categories he himself used. Since I was capable of writing down most of what he said in the beginning of the apprenticeship and everything that was said in the later phases of it, I gathered voluminous field notes. In order to render those notes readable and still preserve the dramatic unity of Don Juan's teachings, I've had to edit them, but what I've deleted is, I believe, immaterial to the points I want to raise. In the case of my work with Don Juan, I've limited my efforts solely to viewing him as a sorcerer and to acquiring membership in his knowledge. For the purpose of presenting my argument, I must first explain the basic premise of sorcery as Don Juan presented it to me. He said that for a sorcerer, the world of everyday life is not real or out there as we believe it is. For a sorcerer, reality, or the world we all know, is only a description. For the sake of validating this premise, Don Juan concentrated the best of his efforts into leading me to a genuine conviction that what I held in mind as the world at hand was merely a description of the world, a description that had been pounded into me from the moment I was born. He pointed out that everyone who comes into contact with a child is a teacher who incessantly describes the world to him, until the moment when the child is capable of perceiving the world as it is described. According to Don Juan, we have no memory of that portentous moment, simply because none of us could possibly have had any point of reference to compare it to anything else. From that moment on, however, the child is a member. He knows the description of the world, and his membership becomes full-fledged, I suppose, when he is capable of making all the proper perceptual interpretations which, by conforming to that description, validate it. For Don Juan, then, the reality of our day-to-day life consists of an endless flow of perceptual interpretations which we, the individuals who share a specific membership, have learned to make in common. The idea that the perceptual interpretations that make up the world have a flow is congruous with the fact that they run uninterruptedly and are rarely, if ever, open to question. In fact, the reality of the world we know is so taken for granted that the basic premise of sorcery, that our reality is merely one of many descriptions, could hardly be taken as a serious proposition. Fortunately, in the case of my apprenticeship, Don Juan was not concerned at all with whether or not I could take his proposition seriously, and he proceeded to elucidate his points in spite of my opposition, my disbelief, and my inability to understand what he was saying. Thus, as a teacher of sorcery, Don Juan endeavored to describe the world to me from the very first time we talked. My difficulty in grasping his concepts and methods stemmed from the fact that the units of his description were alien and incompatible with those of my own. His contention was that he was teaching me how to see, as opposed to merely looking, and that stopping the world was the first step to seeing. For years I had treated the idea of stopping the world as a cryptic metaphor that really didn't mean anything. It was only during an informal conversation that took place towards the end of my apprenticeship that I came to fully realize its scope and importance as one of the main propositions of Don Juan's knowledge. Don Juan and I had been talking about different things in a relaxed and unstructured manner. I told him about a friend of mine, and his dilemma with his 9-year-old son. The child who'd been living with the mother for the past 4 years was then living with my friend, and the problem was what to do with him. According to my friend, the child was a misfit in school. He lacked concentration and wasn't interested in anything. He was given to tantrums, disruptive behavior, and to running away from home. "Your friend certainly does have a problem," Don Juan said, laughing. I wanted to keep on telling him all the terrible things the child had done, but he interrupted me. "There's no need to say any more about that poor little boy," he said. "There's no need for you or for me to regard his actions in our thoughts one way or another." His manner was abrupt, and his tone was firm, but then he smiled. "What can my friend do?" I asked. "The worst thing he could do is to force the child to agree with him," Don Juan said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that child shouldn't be spanked or scared by his father when he doesn't behave the way he wants him to." "How can he teach him anything if he isn't firm with him?" "Your friend should let someone else spank the child." "He can't let anyone else touch his little boy," I said, surprised at his suggestion. Don Juan seemed to enjoy my reaction, and giggled. "Your friend is not a warrior," he said. "If he were, he would know that the worst thing one can do is to confront human beings bluntly." "What does a warrior do, Don Juan?" "A warrior proceeds strategically." "I still don't understand what you mean." "I mean that if your friend were a warrior, he would help his child to stop the world." "How can my friend do that?" "He would need personal power. He would need to be a sorcerer." "But he isn't." "In that case, he must use ordinary means to help his son to change his idea of the world. It's not stopping the world, but it'll work just the same." I asked him to explain his statements. "If I were your friend," Don Juan said, "I would start by hiring someone to spank the little guy. I would go to Skid Row and hire the worst-looking man I could find." "To scare a little boy?" "Not just to scare a little boy, you fool. That little fellow must be stopped, and being beaten by his father won't do it. If one wants to stop our fellow men, one must always be outside the circle that presses them. That way, one can always direct the pressure. The idea was preposterous, but somehow it was appealing to me.